At a gas station, 3 police officers humiliated him simply for being black and looking suspicious. The next day, he walked into their department, not as a suspect, but as their new supervisor, ready to change everything. What happened next would surprise even those who've seen a lot. But let's start from the beginning. James Thompson pulled up to a small gas station on the outskirts of town. It had been a long day, and feeling tired, he stepped out of his car and headed towards the vending machine to buy some water. He'd barely taken a few steps when he noticed 3 police officers standing near the entrance. Their attention immediately shifted to him. A black man in a business suit in this quiet town clearly caught their eye. James remained calm, accustomed to such stares, but the officers seemed intent on more than just looking. One of them, a large blonde officer named Tom Wilson, separated from his colleagues and approached James with a casual air. His smile looked friendly, but his eyes held a spark of disdain. "Show me your ID, sir," Tom said in a tone that left James no choice. Keeping a neutral expression, James slowly pulled out his driver's license and handed it to the officer. Tom took it, studying it for longer than necessary. Then he grimaced, as if seeing something unpleasant. "From out of state?" he asked loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. James gave a short nod, doing his best not to react to the provocation. He explained that he was just stopping to get gas and buy some water. "That's good," Tom replied with a mocking smirk, "because I don't recall seeing locals driving cars like this or wearing suits like that." Bystanders overheard the exchange and started whispering. James could feel their curious eyes burning into his back. Just then, a second officer joined Tom, a younger policeman with a challenging glare. He looked at James and added with undisguised hostility, "You seem kinda suspicious, just hanging around here like this." Remaining composed, James offered to let them check his car, knowing that any refusal would only escalate the situation. Tom needed no further prompting, heading toward James's car with obvious pleasure, and making snide comments to his colleagues about how some people don't belong in cars like these. As Tom rummaged through the car, a third officer decided to question James directly. "What exactly are you doing here? We don't get many visitors hanging around. Care to tell us why you're really in town?" James answered briefly, saying he was here on business, avoiding any further details. But the officers clearly wanted more, and their irritation grew. The bystanders' murmurs grew louder. Some nodded approvingly at the officers, while others frowned, recognizing that James didn't deserve this treatment. But the officers seemed unfazed by the crowd's reactions. At that moment, another car pulled up to the gas station, and Deputy Sheriff Linda Mason stepped out. She immediately noticed that something was wrong. 3 officers were surrounding a man who, though outwardly calm, was clearly feeling the pressure. Linda walked closer, overhearing Tom accusing James of suspicious behavior and waving his driver's license around with exaggerated seriousness. Sensing the situation escalating, Linda decided to intervene, pulling Tom aside and asking what was going on. Tom briefly explained that this man seemed suspicious to him, though he had no real grounds for detaining him. But Tom's expression made it clear that he was simply trying to show off in front of his colleagues. Linda glanced at James, who gave her a slight nod, as if to say he could handle the situation. But Linda wasn't about to let her officers abuse their power. Understanding the situation was slipping out of control, Linda signaled to the officers to step aside and walked over to James to apologize on behalf of her subordinates. Her presence was intended to defuse the situation, but the officers reacted to her intervention with displeasure. They exchanged glances, and Tom muttered to one of his colleagues, "Who does he think he is?" Hearing this, Linda turned sharply and quietly ordered them to stop gossiping and get back to work. She suspected that incidents like this could tarnish the department's reputation, and that minor abuses of power among her subordinates could easily grow into systemic problems. Approaching James, she nodded respectfully and asked if he'd like to file a complaint. James waved it off, saying this wasn't the first and surely wouldn't be the last time he'd been treated with suspicion. "But this time, I think I'll say something," he added, hinting that he had grounds to discuss their behavior. Linda was intrigued by his confidence, but said nothing. Her instincts told her that this man wasn't in this town by chance, and that his connection to the police department might be deeper than it seemed. She apologized again and offered to walk him back to his car. Before leaving, James looked her in the eyes and, with a slight smile, said, "I'll be seeing you soon. By the way, I start working here tomorrow." He deliberately left out his position, but his words left Linda perplexed. She understood that this man wasn't as simple as he first appeared, and that her department was in for some changes. As James drove away, Linda got into her car, mentally preparing for the upcoming day. She knew a new training officer had arrived to work with her team, but she couldn't have guessed she'd just met him at the gas station. The next day, all the town's officers gathered in the police department. Tom, confident in his authority among his colleagues, sat in the front row, exchanging smirks with other officers. They were waiting for the new instructor to conduct a formal meeting and complete another boring training on community relations. Tom chuckled quietly, discussing yesterday's incident at the gas station with his neighbors. Suddenly, Linda entered the room, followed by a man in a business suit, his back turned to the audience. Linda stepped onto the podium and asked everyone to quiet down. "Colleagues, I'd like to introduce you to James Thompson, our new instructor and head of training in our community outreach program. James will be leading training to improve your skills in citizen relations." Linda stepped aside, and James turned to face the audience. The room fell into a shocked silence. The officers recognized James as the very man they had checked so persistently at the gas station the previous day. Tom felt his face pale, his grin frozen on his lips. A thought flashed through his mind that this must be some cruel prank. He grimaced and muttered something under his breath, but James, noticing his reaction, gave a brief look that made it clear he remembered everything. James, maintaining calm and professionalism, greeted everyone and got straight to the point. "Allow me to start with a personal example. Yesterday, I was at a gas station where I experienced behavior that runs counter to this department's mission and the spirit of our town. I was subjected to an unwarranted check simply because I looked suspicious. This is precisely what we're going to change." He directed a pointed gaze at Tom, who shifted uncomfortably, trying to act indifferent, but inwardly feeling the respect of his colleagues slipping away. James continued, "These are exactly the situations where we need to act professionally and not let bias control our actions. We cannot and should not judge people by their appearance." Some officers exchanged glances, clearly reflecting on their actions from the day before. Meanwhile, James began explaining the training program, emphasizing that it would be based on practical and real-life cases. "Each of you will work in teams and participate in role-play scenarios where we'll analyze similar situations. Only those truly committed to public service and working with people will remain on the team." His words carried weight, and the room once again fell into tense silence. In closing, James added, "I'm not here to give lectures. My goal is to change how we approach community relations, and I'll need those of you who are ready to support a new standard. The rest of you might want to reconsider your duties." Linda, seeing the tension in the room, nodded to James and stated her faith in his professionalism and the department's support for this important initiative. Tom understood that his behavior would be under close scrutiny from now on and tried to hide his anxiety, but not very successfully. James began his training, and it quickly became clear that he wasn't going to go easy on anyone. Each session was filled with exercises that forced officers to confront their own biases and beliefs. James shared examples of real cases where even the smallest details mattered. Tom and his colleagues, who often scoffed at boring training sessions, were forced to admit that James knew what he was talking about and that his methods worked. One day, James conducted an exercise putting all the officers in a situation where they, like him at the gas station, found themselves as suspects, feeling the pressure of biased treatment. Tom, cast as the suspect, found himself surrounded by 3 colleagues who bombarded him with humiliating questions and insinuated that he looked suspicious. James observed the scene, noting every reaction Tom had. At first, Tom tried to joke, but when his colleagues pressed him about his appearance, his face darkened. After the exercise ended, James approached Tom. "Now do you understand what it's like?" he asked calmly. Tom, feeling a mixture of shame and irritation, nodded, avoiding James' gaze. He realized he'd come face to face with his own reflection, and though uncomfortable, it gave him insight into what people he'd distrusted must have felt. Each day, the department's attitude towards James changed. Officers who had once viewed him only as a strict instructor began to respect him for his honesty and principles. Even Tom, who had previously mocked the program, gradually came to understand the importance of respecting not just the law, but also human dignity. After several weeks, James held a final session where each officer shared their experiences. Tom stood up and, after a quiet sigh, admitted that he had once thought the training was pointless. He looked at James and added, "But now I understand that working with people requires much more than I thought." Colleagues murmured in surprise, noting the change in him. "In the end," James concluded, "you've all gone through a challenging process, and I'm grateful to those who were willing to change their attitudes. Cultivating respect for others is not easy, but it's essential for each of you and for our community." As James left the department after the final session, Linda caught up with him and thanked him for his work. She confessed that for the first time in a long while, she was seeing such positive changes in her department, and that his methods had left a lasting impact. James simply nodded and said with a slight smile, "This wasn't my victory. It was yours. I just helped you see the world differently." The officers' attitudes toward James changed forever, and Tom, having experienced the sting of prejudice firsthand, finally understood that his duty was to protect, not to humiliate.